July 27th, 1914. Europe is on the brink of war. The Habsburg family and its cadet branch, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, had been masters of Central European politics for nearly 500 years. Not only had their power been slipping steadily for the past 50 years, but the present turmoil had been caused by a succession crisis. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph had only one son, the Crown Prince Rudolf. However, Rudolf's marriage would controversially fail, and along with his mistress would commit suicide at age 30. This devastating blow to the Habsburg family left Archduke Karl Ludwig, the emperor's younger brother, in line for the throne. However, he passed away in 1896, leaving his son, the emperor's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, as the new heir to the throne. Franz Ferdinand was a little bit of a rebellious character, at least in comparison to Franz Joseph, and it's often said that the two clashed like thunder and lightning when they spoke. Nonetheless, Franz Ferdinand was a way to secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty. That's why so much went up in the air on June 28th, when he was assassinated by Serbian Black Hand terrorist Gavrilo Princip. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie had been shot while driving through the streets of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Archduke, a manifestation of Austrian power over the Serbs in Bosnia, had chosen to visit on a Serb holy day, and even at that had escaped the initial execution attempt until accidentally driving into Princip's path. The death was devastating to Franz Joseph, who now saw Karl Ludwig's grandson, Karl, become the fourth crown prince of Franz Joseph's reign. Like Franz Ferdinand had been planning on doing, Karl knew he would likely need to undertake some sort of restructuring of the empire once he gained the throne. But now, on July 27th, 1914, it's important to understand the domestic situation Austria-Hungary was already in on the eve of the war. The Austrians saw the independent Serbian kingdom as the fomenters of the Serb resistance within Austrian borders. Thus, after the assassination, they had issued an ultimatum to Serbia and were now on the eve of declaring war. The situation inside Austria-Hungary's borders was not much better. Let's take a look at the empire's geography on the eve of World War I. You immediately notice mountainous regions and other natural barriers running straight through the middle of the empire, and only occasionally ringing its borders, thus making the empire a collection of politically united, yet geographically somewhat isolated units. Politically, the empire was divided into Cisleithania, meaning the near side of the River Leith, an area that went under the formal name Lands of the Imperial Council. This included the core areas of Vienna and the Archduchy of Austria, but also included the Kingdom of Bohemia and its subrealms of Moravia and South Silesia, and the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. And these lands were ruled by Franz Joseph in his capacity as the Emperor of Austria. Meanwhile, on the far side of the Leith River was Transleithania, or the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen. These were lands ruled by Franz Joseph under the jurisdiction of his Hungarian crown, and included not only the core areas of Budapest and the Kingdom of Hungary, but also included the Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia, as well as the Kingdom of Dalmatia, which was officially part of the lands of the Imperial Council, but due to being cut off from Austria proper, was ruled as part of the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen. Meanwhile, Bosnia-Herzegovina had been occupied by Austria-Hungary for nearly 50 years. However, it had just been annexed formally into the empire in 1908. It was now a condominium of the empire and officially part of both the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen and the lands of the Imperial Council. Now that you know the different political units, let's superimpose the area's population on top of this map to really give you a good picture of how multi-ethnic and divided the area was. We can already see the lines being drawn in the sand that would become the future conflict points following World War I that we will look at, with a few of those disputes hanging around and then coming up during the build-up to World War II. Around the edges of the empire, we see a number of populations that irredentists could argue belong to neighboring countries, such as the Serbs or the Italians, and therefore those populations became ripe for irredentist targets against Austria-Hungary by its neighbors. The military was split up into Austrian and Hungarian specific sections, along with and under the jurisdiction of the combined Imperial and Royal forces. Imperial and Royal, where the initials KUK, in German Kaiserlich und Königlich, was the designation used for anything empire-wide. The empire was a chaotic place, all held together by its patriarch, Franz Joseph. Now, if we fast forward to the latter stages of the war, just a couple of months prior to the collapse, it was now being held together by Emperor Karl, who had ascended the throne in 1916. However, at just age 32, Karl, despite experience fighting on the front, was effectively sidelined at commanding his army by the German field staff. This after Karl had secretly been trying to make peace with the Allies. So Austria-Hungary's fate in the war now appeared tied to Germany's fate. On the 1st of September, the collapse was not imminent yet, and I do want to mention at this point that a lot of the maps for these Austria videos were made prior to some of our other projects, so I apologize if the picture quality isn't quite as good, and there's a few organizational differences. Notably here, we would see both the military and civil administrations set up in Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and northeast Italy, labeled with Austrian-Hungarian. However, I trust you can tell who's running the show in those places. Austria-Hungary had set up civil administrations in both Serbia and Montenegro, with possible intentions on those areas long term. Meanwhile, the Austrians had a military administration in Albania, along with a large portion of northeastern Italy. Much of this Italian territory had actually been under Habsburg rule more than 100 years earlier. In the north, the Austrians occupied and administered a puppet state based in Lublin and covering half of Poland, with Germany likewise running a puppet state out of Warsaw. Meanwhile, to the northeast, the Ukrainians had been granted independence with German support, and while there were some Austrian troops in the country, the great majority of Central Powers forces in Ukraine at this time were German. So thus sits one of the great empires of the world, a direct successor of the Holy Roman Empire, formed nearly 1,000 years before, presently expanded in wartime to reclaim territories it hadn't touched in over 100 years, but an empire teetering, and whether anybody knew it or not, an empire less than 2 months away from dissolution. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with more in the future on the collapse of Austria-Hungary. I'm not sure I'm going to do a daily series as I had originally brought up due to time constraints, but we may still do that or go with a couple longer videos. Either way, we'll be back with the collapse itself, so stay tuned to the channel. Thanks again for watching.